I'd like to speak today about the burial ceremony that took place when Yaakov Avinu passed away. There was a period of mourning in Egypt, and the Torah documents that there was a period of many days of mourning in Egypt, and then finally Yosef receives the permission to bury his father in Eretz Yisrael as he had requested from Paro. And the Torah in Perek Nun, Pasuk Zayin says, Vayal Yosef likbores aviv. And Yosef went up to make Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael to bury his father. Vayalu ito kol avdei Pharaoh ziknei beso v'chol ziknei Eretz Mitzrayim. But he was accompanied by a huge entourage of all of the dignitaries of Egypt. B'chol beis Yosef ve'echo v'beis aviv rak tapam v'tzanam v'vikar mazu be'eretz Goshen. All of the house of Yosef and all of his siblings came with him. You're right. Thank you. Yes, thanks. I appreciate it.
I'm not.
It's okay. It's okay. You notice they didn't set up coffee today. That wasn't because of me. I would have told them that, not everyone fasts. So if you're not fasting, we shouldn't make you suffer. But anyway, that's okay. Okay. All of Yosef's household also, together with his brethren, the only people that they left in Goshen were their children and their livestock. Pasuk Tes says, Vayal imo gam rechev gam porashim vayimachane kaved meod. There were riders and chariots. It was really quite a respectable entourage that went to bury Yaakov. Then the Torah says in Pasuk Yud, Vayavo ad goren ha'atad asher be'ever hayarden. They came to the threshing floor of the Thorn. Now that's a very strange thing. What does that mean even? Goren ha'atad, the threshing floor of the Thorn. Doesn't really make any sense, but that's literally what it means. That was on the other side of the Jordan. And they had a very serious eulogy at that place, very, very big eulogy. And they mourned for his father for 7 days. Okay? So the question is, what's going on over here? They already had a period of mourning in Egypt. They're going to take Yaakov for the Levaya, to the burial. They make a stop along the way at this strange place that has a strange name. It's a threshing floor, a place where you thresh grain, called Ha'atad, known as the Thorn. And they stop there and they stay there for 7 days to eulogize Yaakov a second time before they bury him in Hebron, where we know that is his final burial place. Let me ask you another question. Where is Goren Ha'atad located? What did the Pasuk say? Where is it located? Ever HaYarden. What does that mean? What side of the Jordan is it? It's on the east side of the Jordan. When you're traveling from Egypt to Canaan, to Hebron, how do you get to the other side of the Jordan? So how does that work? How do you get to the east side of the Jordan if you're coming from the west? I'm just asking, Patricia, you were just in Israel. How does that happen? How do we get from Egypt? It's true that when the Jews were traveling in the desert, they went into such a circuitous journey that they ended up in the Moabite territory before they came into Eretz Yisrael.
You wouldn't need to. You just go up the old coast road and then cut in.
Yeah, but you wouldn't need to do this. If they're going to bury Yaakov and they want to take the most direct route, why would they end up on the east side of the Jordan River? It doesn't seem to make any sense. And why are they stopping there in the first place? What is this? What significance is this place?
Maybe they want to, all the people, all the people getting together to see Yaakov.
Oh, okay, so it's possible maybe they traveled in order to make stops on the way so that all of the other nations could pay their respects. That's possible. Okay, that's a possibility. And as a matter of fact, that's what it says in Pasuk Yud Aleph. Vayar Yoshev ha'aretz ha'kenaniyas ha'evil begoren ha'atad. All of the other nations that were living in the region of Canaan, see the great mourning that is taking place in this area called Goren Ha'atad, the threshing floor of the Thorn. Vayomeru Evel Kaved Zela Mitzrayim. Al Kain Karashama Avel Mitzrayim Asher Be'ever HaYarden. And they said, look at this great mourning that is occurring for Egypt, because they saw that it was an Egyptian entourage. And so they therefore called its name the Mourning of Egypt, that is located on the Transjordan. So Vayasu banav Lokain kasher tzivam, so his sons fulfilled his final wishes. Vayisu oso banav artza Kenan, vayikbiru oso b'maras de Amachpela, asher kana Avraham es asadeh alachus as kevrem es Ephron achiti al pnei Mamre, and they therefore transported him to the land of Canaan. They buried him in the Machpelah cave, which Avraham had purchased from Ephron for the purposes of burial of the family. And so Yaakov Avinu ends up being the last person to be buried in Ma'aras HaMachpelah, at least of the original people that were intended to be buried there. We know that there are other people buried in the cave of Machpelah today just because of different historical events. And there are other bones that are in Ma'aras HaMachpelah, which, by the way, is why it's problematic for a Kohen to go into Ma'aras HaMachpelah today. Okay, even if you wanted to argue that the four zugos, the four pairs, do not transmit tumah, but we know for a fact that there are other skeletal remains in Ma'aras HaMachpelah other than Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Adam and Chava, and Adam and their spouses. Okay. So what do we make of this whole story? Why was it necessary to stop at Goren Ha'atad, have a new period of mourning for 7 days before proceeding to Yaakov Avinu's final resting spot? They've already mourned in Egypt. If they want an additional period of mourning, let them go straight to Hebron, bury Yaakov, and mourn there. Okay. The Kli Yakar asks these questions plus a series of questions, and if you take a look at the Kli Yakar, he says as follows. V'nira mikan raya l'masha amru chazal, shebischus Yaakov pasak hara'av, v'chasher meit Yaakov chazar hara'av limakomo. The Kli Yakar says that it seems from this whole story that we can substantiate the Medrash. The Medrash tells us that when Yaakov, as soon as he came to Egypt, the famine stopped. Even though the famine was predicted to take place for 7 years, it stopped after 2 years because Yaakov Avinu at that point came down to Egypt. And the Medrash then says, but when Yaakov died and his body left Egypt, the famine immediately returned. Ve'al kain asu hamitzrim evel kaved ba'avur ki chavad hara'av kivarishona. So the reason why the Egyptians mourned so strongly for Yaakov was not just because they lost an old Jew, but rather because the repercussions were that the famine returned to Egypt. Ki hirgishu hamitzrim davar zeh sheyachzor harav lekadmuto yedei neiseh shekara lehem baderech. He says, how did they know, this entourage, how did they know that the famine was returning to Egypt if they're now traveling with the body? Because they experienced some miraculous phenomenon on their travels. Ki pitom nizdamein lahem goren echad shahaya mukaf kotzim mikol tzad. Because as they're traveling, they immediately encounter this very bizarre threshing floor, a place that is reserved for threshing grain, that is surrounded on all sides by thorns. Ad shelo haya nishar petach oderech lavo el hagoren. And it is so completely surrounded by thorns that there's no way to even access the threshing floor. I mean, it's one thing to create a security system, but you have to be able to get in. This threshing floor was completely surrounded by thorns. No one could get in. But they viewed this as a symbol. They saw this threshing floor as a symbol for them. This was their symbol. While this tzaddik was alive, we had access to the threshing floor, which is the place where you get grain from. We had access to food when this tzaddik was alive. Uvemoto ya'akvu alav harishaim shenimshu l'kotzim. But now that he's dead, and all that remains are the wicked in Egypt, the wicked who are like thorns prevent us from having any further access to the food basket that was represented by the tzaddik Yaakov. Shelo yihi elem od derech el hagoren kasher haya lehem lifnim kisar tzila me'alehem. They no longer had that divine protection of Yaakov Avinu. Uvaparshas Shemos b'pasuk vayakutzu mipnei b'nei Yisrael. He says, and this is how we can connect this pasuk to a pasuk we're going to see in Parsha Shemos in next week's parsha. Because there it says that the Egyptians became disgusted by the populous growth of the Jewish people. So we'll explain over there, Be'ezer Hashem shamitzrim nimshlu lekotzim, Be'erech kerem Hashem tzavakos beis Yisrael, that the word vayakutsu means they became disgusted, but it also comes from the word kotz, which is thorns or thistles. That the Egyptians are like thorns to the vineyard of the Jewish people. Al kein nirmaz lahem shebavur rishas hamitzrim yachzor harav lekadmuso. And that's the illusion of this, or the symbol of this threshing floor surrounded by thorns. You, the Egyptians, are the thorns that are preventing your access to the food, the plenty that was made accessible to you by the tzaddik Yaakov. We skip a little bit further down in the Kli Yakar, and he says as follows: When the Egyptians in this entourage with Yaakov saw this miraculous phenomenon, a very bizarre kind of threshing barn that is enclosed on all sides with thorns, miyad hirgishu shegadar Hashem ba'adam leviltet lahem mavo el hagoren od. That's, they immediately felt that this was the message. The message was they're not going to have access to the food granary anymore. Al kain hispidu mit hamitzrim evil kaved ratzalomar al koved harav. So their hesped, their mourning and eulogy, was not over Yaakov at this point. They'd already mourned for Yaakov. Their mourning was for the fate, the sad fate of Egypt, which had returned back to its famine state. And now we can understand why the Egyptians eulogized at this particular point and not beforehand. So the Canaanim of the region see this and they say, hey, where are you guys from? They said, we're from Egypt. Well, then why are you stopping here? Why didn't you have this whole mourning process already in Egypt? Why did you have to stop here to go through the 7-day period of mourning? It says, but they concluded this must mean something terrible on a national level has occurred to Egypt that they've just discovered. Because it means something calamitous is going to happen, that the famine is going to return to Egypt. And that's why they called it Evel Kaved LeMitzrayim. Evel Kaved Zel LeMitzrayim, as it says in Pasuk Yud Aleph. This is a great period of mourning for Egypt. It's not a great mourning for the Jewish people. It's not a great mourning now that they're doing for the Jewish people, because they already eulogized Yaakov in Mitzrayim. This is an Avil for Egypt. It's a recognition, it's a realization that not only is the death of Yaakov a personal tragedy for Yaakov's family, but it's a national tragedy for all of Egypt, because we no longer have the protection of that tzaddik. Okay? That's the Kli Yakar's analysis of this. But I'd like to offer perhaps a slightly different explanation. We know, the Ramban tells us this in a number of places, that Maaseh Avos Simin Labanim. We know that there's this concept that many of the stories that take place in Sefer Bereshis, in the book of Genesis, take place to actualize something that's going to happen in the future history of the Jewish people. Why was Avraham told to walk the entire span, the width and breadth of all of Eretz Yisrael? Because he needed to actualize in a real physical way the future possession and inheritance of the land of Israel for his future progeny. Many of the stories that take place are a portent of what's going to happen to the Jewish people in the future. And I think that this is no exception. The reason why the children of Yaakov, literally Bnei Yisrael, are transporting him in this circuitous route is because they know prophetically how they're going to return to Eretz Yisrael. they're going to return to Eretz Yisrael eventually after their servitude is over in exactly the same route, traveling from Egypt through the Sinai Peninsula, eventually ending up on the other side of the Jordan River and then coming back into Eretz Yisrael proper. And when we look at it from that perspective, then we perhaps can understand what the idea of the threshing floor is, which is right at the border of Eretz Yisrael on their way in. It is a message and a portent to all those who want to go into Eretz Yisrael and take possession of it. Because what is a threshing floor? A threshing floor is a place where you separate grain and prepare it for consumption. What do you do on a threshing floor? On a goren? You thresh. What is threshing? What is threshing? Anyone tell me what threshing is? You separate the wheat from the chaff. And how do you separate wheat from the chaff? How do you do it? The act of threshing is actually a violent, kind of physical, forceful act. You have to bang the wheat on the stone floor in order for the husks to break apart from the kernel. And then you winnow. I mean, I'm not an expert in the process. I've never worked on a farm. But I can just tell you what we know based on what the Gemara in Shabbos talks about, the different processes of separating the wheat from the chaff. What?
We're learning that in Talmud.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, but the first is to do some violent, blunt force, trauma to the wheat in order to break apart the chaff from the kernel. Okay, so it involves pain, it involves trauma, and it involves separation. It's interesting that that's the kind of process that is involved when the Jewish people make their way back to Eretz Yisrael, not only when they leave Egypt to go into Eretz Yisrael, but also what's going to happen in the time of the Messianic redemption. There's going to be a period of separation of the wheat from the chaff, where the Jewish people are going to have some kind of separation process. There will be certain Jews who are removed from the kernel because they will be totally assimilated and lost through the long gullus, through the process of assimilation. And that separation process, just like Egypt is called the Kor HaBarzel, the iron cauldron, which purifies impure ore and separates the rock from the metal, so too the gullus that we are in today as well is a process of separation through pain, through exertion of trauma, right? Either heat, or which is the process of separation of metal from ore, or in a threshing barn, the trauma of force that we experience separates the Jews. Some confront the suffering of Gullus by leaving Yiddishkeit, and some confront the suffering of Gullus by becoming closer to Hashem, and that's the separation process. It's therefore no coincidence that when we learn about the history of the Messianic age, throughout Jewish history, we confront a goren, we confront a threshing barn. What's the first chapter of the Messianic process? The very first chapter of the Messianic process is the story of Ruth. It's the story of Ruth because she's the great-grandmother of David HaMelech. And where does she have the intimate confrontation with Boaz? In a goren, in a threshing barn, as you see in front of you in Rus Perek Gimel. Where was Boaz sleeping for the night? He was sleeping on the floor of a threshing barn. Now, is it just this coincidence that he happened to be sleeping there for the night? Well, if you're a farmer, I guess you could make a tent over a threshing barn and use that as your place of sleeping. Boaz was probably a little bit wealthier than that, so it's unclear as to why he was particularly that night sleeping in the threshing barn. I guess if I was a farmer, I would understand a little better. But the fact of the matter is that Naomi gives instructions to Ruth. You're going to find Boaz tonight sleeping in the goren. Go, and that's where you're going to meet him. Because your union and your marriage to him is going to represent the process of what takes place in the goren, the painful process of redemption that's going to unfold over the course of millennia. Similarly, we find another chapter of the Messianic process, which is the building of the temple. It takes place in a goren, takes place in a threshing barn. What was the Temple Mount before King David purchased it? from Aravna HaYavusi at the end of Sefer Shmuel. Well, Aravna, who was the owner of the property of the Temple Mount, was using it as a goren, was using it as a threshing floor, was using it as a place of processing wheat, separating it from its chaff and making it edible and making it a source of nourishment. And what do we mean, therefore, when we say that a threshing floor is surrounded by thorns? Because that's been the history of the Jewish people. Not only is the separation going to take place in a traumatic way, but it's also going to be surrounded by the thorns, the pain of having to, that is necessary in order for us to once again be able to access the granary, the place of purification. So in the process of purification, many Jews would be Egyptified, right? That's what's going to happen. When the Jews, we know that when the Jewish people left Egypt, V'chamushim alu v'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim, the Torah says that only 1/5 of them came out of Egypt. Why? Because the other 4/5 were assimilated. That's the separation process that happens throughout the centuries. So when we say that it's an Avel Gadol LeMitzrayim, when it's a great mourning for Egypt, what we mean to say is that there are certain Jews who are going to be Egyptified, and we have to mourn the loss of part of our nation who will not be able to make it all the way back into Eretz Yisrael at the time of redemption. That's the mourning that is taking place at this Goren Ha'atad, at this threshing floor of thorns. That's why it's called Avel Kaved Zel Mitzrayim. This is a terrible mourning process for Egypt, referring to the Jews who have become Egyptified and are no longer recognizable as the Jewish people. Only those Jews who are going to be able to leave behind their diaspora persona will be welcomed back to the land and allowed to be reunited with their forefathers. It's not an easy process to leave Egypt and to come back to Eretz Yisrael. I can tell you that the separation process continues to this day, and we're even seeing it more acutely as there's become a polarization regarding Eretz Yisrael among diaspora Jewry. That there are some diaspora Jews who are now not only indifferent to the land of Israel, but have become oppositional to the land of Israel. And there are other Jews who are realizing that without Israel, we truly are defenseless and subject to more and more suffering. And it's really up to us to decide whether in the threshing process of our diaspora, we're going to allow ourselves to be able to make it back into Eretz Yisrael, whether we'll be the chaff or whether we'll be the wheat. Just because a person is frum doesn't automatically define them as the wheat and not the chaff. There has to be an effort to divest ourselves of the persona, like we talked about in the Kuzari this morning, about all of the assimilative acculturation that is a product of our living in a diaspora, a community for so many centuries. That's what I think is going on over here when the rest of the nations come along and they see the Egyptian mourning. What they're actually being witness to is this very painful process of the Jewish people in the end of days making their way back to Eretz Yisrael. Some Jews will be oppositional to it, some Jews will be in favor of it, and there's going to be this struggle, and eventually the losers, as we make our way into Eretz Yisrael, will be the ones who are left behind as the Egyptians, the ones who can't make that transition from a diaspora existence to the Eretz Yisrael existence. That's why it's more important than ever to be able to make sure that we're ready to make that transition. Hopefully we can make the transition before we're forced to make the transition from Egypt to the land of Canaan, from Golus to Eretz Yisrael. So everyone have a great day, have an easy fast, meaningful fast, and we'll see Mirz Hashem next week.